Hello and welcome to another video review and the last of the classic games in the Monkey Island series. This is Escape from Monkey Island for PC, Mac, and PlayStation 2. This is a 3D adventure game and the fourth game in the Monkey Island series. It was developed by LucasArts and released in November of 2000 for PC, later released for Mac and PlayStation 2, and it's actually the third of the LucasArts adventure games to get released on console, the other two being The Secret of Monkey Island and Maniac Mansion. And it represents a pretty big departure from the previous games in the series, mostly in the fact that this is actually a 3D adventure game as opposed to a point-and-click adventure game. The control scheme has been modified to work with keyboard only this time around, and it plays a lot like Grim Fandango if you've ever played that, mostly because it uses the same engine. It was actually the second, and really one of only two games, that used the same engine as Grim Fandango, the Grime engine, or Grim engine, whichever you would prefer to call it. It's spelled as Grime, but it actually stands for Grim engine. It's weird. Anyway, the point being that this is a departure from the point-and-click style, so the question there becomes, how did that affect it? Now, it was pretty well received when it came out. I mean, people seemed to enjoy the game quite a bit and seemed to overlook its flaws, although there were a few people who raised a stink over certain elements of the game. And I'll get more into that when I get to the story and the gameplay parts of this. But ultimately the question is this: how does this play out compared to the previous Monkey Island games? And more importantly, does it live up to their legacy? Because, again, the original Monkey Island is one of the best games ever made. Its sequels, at least Monkey Island 2 and The Curse of Monkey Island, are both fantastic adventure games in their own right. So, how is this one? Does it stack up well, or does it not stack up all that well? Well, as far as presentation goes, it's both a step up and a step back compared to the previous games in the series. It's a step up in that it's a 3D adventure game, and for its time it actually looked fairly good. Although it has aged about as well as an old rotting fruit, so there is that to keep in mind. I mean, by modern standards, this looks absolutely terrible. Everything is rather blocky. They have pre-rendered backgrounds that, while okay, are very, very sparse in detail, especially compared to the previous games where they were just packed with detail. There's a lot of jagged edges, the animations aren't particularly good, and so on and so forth. And it's also kind of odd because they tried to maintain that cartoony art style that they had with The Curse of Monkey Island, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it really doesn't work all that well. It has mostly to do with the quality of the graphics and how well they've aged, but really, they did the best they could to maintain that art style, and they mostly succeeded, apart from bits here and there. So at least it's bright and colorful, and it has some charm to it despite how poorly the graphics have aged. But it really doesn't give you a great first impression with this thing. And it especially doesn't help that because it's an older 3D adventure game, it actually has some issues running on modern systems. You basically need to get a patch, which I will link in the video description box, to actually be able to install and play the game, because it just has horrible issues on especially 64-bit operating systems. And I mean, if I try to run this thing in windowed mode, then it just locks up constantly, it crashes all the time, and if I run it in full screen mode, it looks horrible. So it's just kind of a double-edged sword there. At the time, it was pretty interesting, and the graphics were fairly good for their time, but again, with age, that doesn't help things out. And then there's the sound design, which is kind of all over the place. On the one hand, you have that very strong soundtrack that has returned, although it feels like a rehash of the previous games as opposed to a sort of fresh and exciting take on the Monkey Island stuff. I mean, the main theme, for example, sounds like it was basically ripped directly from The Curse of Monkey Island, with some extremely minimal changes thrown in there for good measure, and it really doesn't help the game out all that much. What new tracks there are don't really pick up the slack all that well, and even though the soundtrack is good, it just doesn't have quite the same magic that the previous games did. It actually feels like it's just a rehash. At least they brought back the voice actors from the previous game, except for the one who played Elaine, which was Alexandra Boyd. They replaced her with Charity James for this one, although Boyd would come back to play the character in Tales of Monkey Island and, of course, the special editions of the first two games. So that's a good thing. So there is quite a bit of consistency between The Curse of Monkey Island and Escape from Monkey Island in terms of its cast, although there was also one other character who had a voice change between those two games, but it's kind of a secondary character, so you don't really notice it as much. And they still do a great job with what they're given. It's pretty hard to do comedic timing and everything well, and these actors and actresses just have it, for the most part. There are a few lines here and there that are kind of awkward, but generally speaking, they hit the nail on the head most of the time. The one issue I did find is that the actual voice clips themselves, the actual sound files, are just that late 90s, very early 2000s style of quality. And by that I mean they're kind of heavily compressed and they sound weird and tinny in a lot of spots. So that may affect your enjoyment of the game a very slight amount. It didn't really bother me because I'm just used to that kind of thing. But if you're not used to that kind of thing, then I can see it kind of getting on your nerves after a while. But it's not that big of a problem. And it does go quite a way to lending this game some charm. Although, let's face it, the presentation is not all that charming to a modern gamer. It's just old. It feels old. And that is something you're probably going to have to get past if you're going to try to play this thing. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this takes place after the events of The Curse of Monkey Island, in which the end of Curse of Monkey Island saw Guybrush Threepwood and Elaine Marley going on their honeymoon. And they return for their honeymoon in this to find that Elaine has been declared dead and her position as governor has been revoked. And they're trying to destroy her mansion as well. So, right off the bat, that's what you need to resolve. You need to stop them from trying to demolish the mansion. You need to see about getting declared not dead, or undead if you prefer. And you're given the objective to go and find the family lawyers in order to be able to get a restraining order and get legal advice and things like that. And from there, eventually, you find out that there is an Australian land developer named Ozzy Mandrill buying up all the land in the Caribbean and turning it into incredibly corny, consumerist theme parks and resorts and such. And he's actually after the secrets of the ultimate insult, which is just this kind of voodoo artifact that does unspeakable things, basically. And so he's off to try to find that particular artifact, and you also have to stop him from doing so. This is all stuff that's revealed in Act 1, so I'm not really spoiling very much for you here. But here's the problem with the story in this game. It's ridiculous. And it's not ridiculous in the good way. See, in the previous games, they had some kind of goofy stories, but they felt like they fit together. Although the end bit of Monkey Island 2 was just way out there. When you get to Escape from Monkey Island, it's just kind of like, what? What's going on? I have no clue what's going on at this point. And that's how it feels throughout the entire game. It's just kind of one string of weird offbeat humor to another, and it doesn't really flow anywhere near as well as the previous games in the series. It's not really anywhere near as coherent. And even though there is a coherent story to this thing, it's just not all that satisfying to go through. Certainly not compared to the previous games, where first off you had a very clear end goal in sight, and you don't even really have a clear end goal until really the beginning of Act 2 when Ozzy and LeChuck come into play. And while Ozzy is introduced in Act 1, he's not really given his motivation until toward the end of the act, and you find out about LeChuck's involvement in Act 2. So the ultimate end goal becomes stopping them from launching their evil plots. And from there, the plot doesn't really do all that much. It just kind of sputters out and doesn't really resolve itself all that satisfyingly. It's kind of a weird situation where all three of the previous games were just much more satisfying in the plot department than this one is, even though they didn't even have particularly great plots either. This one just feels slapped together from ideas from the cutting room floor. And even though it does have a pretty good sense of humor about it on occasion, there's a lot of jokes in this one that just fall flat. And some of them just come completely out of nowhere, and you're just like, wait, what? Why is this here? This doesn't mean anything, really. For example, there's a bit during the marsh sequence, which I will talk a bit more about when I get to the gameplay part of this, where you encounter yourself, and you have to basically match exactly what yourself did. It's really weird, it doesn't go anywhere, and it's completely out of place. And it certainly isn't all that funny either. There's a lot of stuff like that, where it's just this weird, absurd humor that doesn't really make you laugh. And then there's the occasional witty stuff that does make you laugh. Although they do recycle several things in this. For example, they brought back insult sword fighting, but you can't win the sword fight. And that's because you're fighting against Ozzy. It's just an optional thing you can do. And because he uses Australian insults, you have no idea what he's saying, and you can't respond to them. And toward the beginning of the game, they have insult arm wrestling, which shows off the fact that the insult paradigm has gone to other mediums as well, and it's just frankly stupid. And oddly enough, for a game that relies on a lot of callbacks to previous games in the series to kind of get the nostalgia factor going, they don't really do a great job of showing off the old school stuff in the more modern engine. For example, the scum bar looks basically nothing like it used to, so right off the bat you just go, wait, this doesn't seem right. And that's the kind of feeling you get throughout the course of the game. It just doesn't feel quite right. It doesn't quite feel like a Monkey Island game, even though they definitely tried pretty hard at times to make it feel so. And that's part of the problem, because there's occasions where the Monkey Island nature kind of seeps through the cracks, but then there's the rest of the game, which just doesn't feel like Monkey Island. It feels like it's rehashing things, and it doesn't really feel like they actually got that brand of humor correct. So it ends up just kind of falling flat most of the time. But then there's the gameplay. I'm going to be extremely upfront with you on this one. I literally hate this game, and it is purely because of how awful the gameplay is. Whoever had the brilliant idea that a Monkey Island game, which previous to this they were all point-and-click adventure games, should be controlled using only the keyboard, needs to be smacked in the face with a fish. Preferably a fish that has been rotting for quite some time, so the stink factor is multiplied by a ridiculous degree. You see, this is the number one problem with Escape from Monkey Island. It is horrible to control. You move around with the arrow keys, and whenever you press left or right, you're turning very, very slowly. You press forward to move forward according to your character's facing. You press backward to sort of move backward, and it doesn't really ever get used, so I don't really care. Instead, what ends up happening is you try to use the run feature, which makes you go faster because you move at a painfully slow pace if you walk. And guess what that does? It means you start careening into the obstacles and it gets turned around to a ridiculous degree. I could not tell you the number of times I got stuck on level geometry that I couldn't even see, by the way, because the pre-rendered backgrounds didn't really do a great job of showing off that level geometry. I would go to a spot where I would be like, okay, this is wide open for me to walk through. No, it isn't. It's an invisible wall. Okay, I'll walk slightly to the left. Oh, that's where you have to go. Why? I hate that crap. And even worse is when you try to manipulate things in the environment. Now, if you just go up to pick something up or just use a stationary object, usually it's not that hard to work with. You just go up to it and you press the U key, oddly enough. That's the default. The U key is interact. I brings up your inventory. P picks things up, and L looks at things. It's really awkward. But generally speaking, if you're interacting with a stationary object that there's no timing-based stuff around, it's not that bad. You can deal with it, because all you do is walk up to it and you press the U key. When it comes to using the inventory, what you have to do is you press the I key, you scroll through your inventory using only the cursor keys, you find whatever it is you want to use, and either you press U to select it and make it interact with something else in your inventory, or you press Enter and it will pick the object out and you will actually have it in your hands and be able to use it with objects in the environment. You get used to that after a while, but it is very awkward. But then there's the problem that kills it. Timing-based puzzles with controls that suck. Now, if it were just one timing-based puzzle, then I might be able to overlook it. There are a lot of timing-based puzzles in this thing. They're all incredibly annoying, and it's all entirely due to how awful the controls are. Because you have to do things in a very short time span, and you have to time things just right while watching your character go through these animations. That's another thing you have to worry about. With regards to actually using things in the environment, it doesn't actually rely on when you press the button. It relies on when your character goes through the appropriate animation to do whatever it is you're trying to do. So if you're off by a few seconds, or you're off by even a millisecond, guess what? You failed the puzzle, you gotta do it again. There was one puzzle, for example, where I kept having to redo it over and over and over again because I couldn't get the timing right in order to get an object to stop in a specific location so I could actually progress with the game. I had to retry that puzzle probably at least 10 or 15 times, just because I couldn't get the timing down. I would press the button right when I thought it would actually do it, and it's like, nope, we're going to stop the thing after wherever you need it to be stopped. Okay, well, I'll do it a bit before. Stopped it too far before, and I kept having to adjust it over and over and over again until finally it decided to stop in the right location. And it was just mind-bogglingly irritating that I had to redo that over and over and over again, just because the timing-based stuff is so incredibly hard to do with such crappy controls and animation-based timings. But it gets better, and by better I mean worse. There's other puzzles in this game that are resolved around timing. For example, you have to go through a lava flow, and you have to time it just right so that you can actually get through a certain path and be able to grab an object using a banana picker, which you have to go into your inventory to get, I might add. And I had to redo that tons and tons of times just because it kept screwing up and not actually going the direction I wanted it to go. And that should highlight the trial and error nature of this game. Most of the puzzles really aren't that hard to figure out, or if they are hard to figure out, it's not so much because they're actually challenging puzzles, but rather that they rely way too much on trial and error, and even better, randomized solutions. The marsh that I mentioned is a randomized puzzle. Whenever you start the game, it's going to change what you're actually working with. Now, by that I mean you have to start a brand new game, and that will change whatever the puzzle solution is. So, when you actually get to the puzzle itself, it's going to have the same general solution, but the specifics are going to be different. In this particular case, the solution relies around numbers, and these numbers change after you start a new game. So if you get stuck and you need a walkthrough or something, guess what? You're screwed, because you have no way of actually being able to find a chart for what you need to do. Now, the solution to the puzzle is pretty easy, admittedly, but it's just annoying to deal with. Luckily, that's not the worst example of this kind of puzzle. The worst example of it is probably the worst thing I've ever seen in an adventure game. Monkey combat. I'm going to let that sink in for a moment. Monkey combat. Obviously, it's parodying Mortal Kombat, but when you actually get into it, you find that not only is it basically like insult sword fighting or insult arm wrestling or whatever, in that you need to learn insults in order to be able to defeat your opponents and thus complete the full length of the puzzle, but it's also timing based and it's randomized. So here's how it works. You have 4 words that you need to combine in order to get different stances. These are ak, chi, eek, and oop. And using various combinations of these 4 words will allow you to go into one of 5 different combat stances. Each combat stance will beat 2 other combat stances. And you might think, oh, well, I can just look up a chart or something for all the combinations so I don't need to worry about it. Nuh-uh. It's randomized. Every single playthrough is randomized, much like the Marsh is. So when you click Start New Game, it's going to be completely different from somebody else's playthrough. So you need to figure out all of the insults on your own, through trial and error. And then you need to organize it into your own chart for this. And it's only good for that one playthrough. If you decide to play through the game again for whatever reason, maybe you're a masochist, then you're gonna have to do that all over again. Sounds great, doesn't it? Oh, and by great, I mean it's basically like smacking your head repeatedly into a concrete wall. It's stuff like that that makes me wonder what sadist designed these stupid puzzles. If you ever wondered why the adventure game genre died out for such a long time, it's stuff like this. I am not being hyperbolic when I say this is the kind of game that makes me want to become a supervillain just so I can eradicate the entire universe and thus make this game not exist. It's certainly nowhere near the worst game ever made or anything like that. In fact, if you take it at face value, it's really not a bad game. But it does everything in its power to make you hate it. And it succeeds brilliantly at that. I hate Escape from Monkey Island. I loved Monkey Island 1 through 3. All 3 of those are fantastic games. And then you come to this. I wish this game didn't exist. But unfortunately, it does. I cannot remotely recommend it. If you are a masochist, you might be able to get something out of it. But I didn't have any fun with this thing. Like I said, most of the humor falls flat. The story's not very good. The puzzles are either incredibly weak or incredibly infuriating just because they're not really all that challenging, but they have stupid timing-based crap, or the controls get in your way, or they're randomized. If you at all value adventure games, do not play Escape from Monkey Island. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go play some games that I absolutely love, just so I can forget that I played through this thing again. Thanks for watching.
Goodbye, cruel adventure game. Forget it.